In the Pulitzer Prize-winning historical exposé, Slavery by Another Name, Wall Street Journal correspondent Douglas Blackmon details how prison camps, involuntary servitude, and human labor trafficking not only carried slavery in America into the 20th century, but also helped build the fortunes of governments and private corporations while thrusting upon thousands of African Americans generations of poverty. Today, there are struggles to protect the rights of laborers and to also significantly reduce the number of families living in poverty. And there is a connection to this history. We'll talk about it next on Black Issues Forum.
Quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.
Hello and welcome to Black Issues Forum. I'm Deborah Holt-Noel. The 2009 Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Douglas Blackmon, Slavery by Another Name, uncovers the suppressed history of re-enslavement in America that was enacted through the sale of Black Americans into forced labor camps run by state and local governments, farmers, even large private corporations. It was a system that criminalized simple random acts in order to shore up a population of free labor that built up the fortunes of corporations like U.S. Steel and impacted a legacy of poverty for generations of Black Americans. This episode in history reveals much about the lengths that have been gone to for the sake of a dollar, and may inform our understanding about the current state of poverty and even the fight to protect labor rights. We'll talk to two experts working in these areas here in North Carolina. But first, let's take a look at a clip from a PBS documentary based on Blackmon's book and bearing the same title, Slavery by Another Name.
I grew up in Monticello, Georgia, which is a small town about 90 miles south of Atlanta. My paternal grandmother was the daughter of John S. Williams. He died long before I was born. But I heard from my uncles, from my father, from people who knew him that he was a wonderful man. He was well respected in the community.
In 1921, almost 18 years after the peonage trials, federal investigators visited the Williams farm to follow up on reports that he was holding peons.
There's a group of Black men out in the field. The men are obviously terrified, unwilling to say almost anything. They're emaciated. They clearly have been terribly abused. John Williams suddenly appears.
He pleads that he didn't know this was against the law, that he'll do better. His intentions were good, very apologetic to these federal officials. And they leave. And he doesn't know what they're going to do. He knows they found evidence that he was holding these people in slavery. He talks to his foreman, Clyde Manning, and says, as the court transcript said, we've got to do away with these boys.
The family story was that he had worked prisoners on his farm, that they were hardened criminals and they had been put in the penitentiary for a long time. And one night, a lot of the prisoners tried to escape. And he, along with other farmers who were working these men, tracked them down and in the process of recapturing them, killed some of them. Then sometime later, the story came to light for me. It was, of course, totally different from the story that I had heard.
Williams and Manning, the black foreman, systematically hunted and murdered 11 black workers. Some were bludgeoned. Others were weighted down with chains and forced into a nearby river. Another was made to dig his own grave.
They did it in the most horrific ways that you can imagine that I really can't talk about. I just get so emotional when I think about not just the fact that these men were murdered, but the cruelty with which it was carried out. That's what's hardest for me to imagine and hardest to accept.
And it came to light only because a little boy was fishing down by the creek where they'd thrown some of the bodies, and one of the bodies came up.
In the spring of 1921, Williams and Manning each faced an all-white jury in a Georgia state court. Both were found guilty and given life sentences. Within a decade, both had died in prison. Williams was the first Southern white man since 1877 to be indicted for the first-degree murder of an African American. It would not happen again until 1966.
And that clip was from the documentary Slavery by Another Name, based on the book by Douglas Blackmon. And here with us today to help us connect the past to the present, I'd like to introduce Ngaza Laughinghouse, one of the founding members of North Carolina Black Workers for Justice and president of North Carolina's Public Service Workers Union, Local 150, and Jean Nickel, director of the University of North Carolina Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out.
It's great to be here.
Doing well, doing well. Ngaza, I'd like to start with you. This is an extraordinary book. And I know that both of you have had an opportunity to just glance at it and also read through it, but help us to understand how a book like this can help shed light on the plight of workers today.
I can tell you that just recently at a luncheon of some Durham City Workers Union members this past Saturday, one of our members from Connecticut asked, why are the conditions here so bad for workers? Why are there so few unions? It's because of this long, ongoing legacy of historic, racist, national oppression, the super exploitation, post-slavery. The workers not having the basic democratic rights, government not supporting the kind of policies that somehow empower workers to stand up and exercise their human rights to a safe, fair workplace. Good case in point. The North Carolina General Statute 9598. This law was passed at a time when black workers had no power, no democratic right to vote. And they passed a law that strips them of the right to collectively bargain, the right to bargain over their wages, their working conditions, their general treatment. It certainly, this book, I think, just shares some sort of historical context in terms of the ongoing legacy of slavery and how it impacts working people today.
And Jean, can you share with us, given what's been revealed in this book, essentially the extension of slavery through the 20th century, talk a little bit about how that has impacted poverty today, and particularly African Americans living in poverty?
Well, I suppose the notion of legacy is a very powerful one. And for a lot of us in present times, we want to pretend, perhaps, that there's no continuing legacy from the really dark and tragic aspects of American history and the history of slavery, in particular in the United States and in the state of North Carolina. But the truth is, if we look at the present circumstance of North Carolina, we have demeaning and great transgressions against constitutional principle of equality by the nature of poverty in North Carolina. You could say that across the board. Almost 1 in 5 Tar Heels living in really wrenching poverty, but those numbers are far more pronounced for black North Carolinians, for people of color. Over a quarter of black North Carolinians live in poverty. Over 40% of black kids in North Carolina live in poverty. Really astonishing numbers for the wealthiest nation on earth, the wealthiest nation in human history. So our present circumstance not only reveals and flows from a very troubling and challenging history, but it indicates and presents on a daily basis denials of equality, which are very difficult to square with the things that we pledge allegiance to every day, that we claim as our broad-based foundational social commitments. So we are not done with this question of discrimination and its impact, its present impact, and its long historical legacies. North Carolina is not one equal commonwealth as it is charged to be, and we've got great work ahead on that front.
As great a state as this is, and it is a great state, do those numbers tend to fly by people, you think? I mean, 40% of African American children living in poverty in our state?
Yes, they do fly by people. The greatest challenge to American poverty and poverty in North Carolina, I think, is that so many of us now simply turn our gaze away from the powerful transgressions of poverty. For a lot of us, we think, well, our kids are doing well, our friends' kids are doing well. We know that there may be some folks who are facing really powerful barriers, but maybe they're across the street or across the county. They're in another part of the state. We're about to start a poverty tour tomorrow, which will focus on eastern North Carolina. You can look at the economic history of eastern North Carolina and trace it directly, unalterably, to slavery. North Carolina has suffered chronic high poverty, racially disproportionate high poverty, and it has done so since Reconstruction. Eastern North Carolina suffers every day from the scars of the history of this state and the history of the country, and I think far too many of us want to ignore that. We deal with it by sort of, I like the notion that we just kind of turn our gaze this way, and if folks are doing okay over here, it may be that there are people who are facing real difficulty and challenges, but we choose just not to pay attention to it. Then we can be the wealthiest nation in the world, but have radically disproportionate levels of poverty and still claim to ourselves, well, this is the bastion of freedom and equal dignity. This is the nation which cares the most about equal justice. This is the place where it would be best to be a poor kid, when in fact, the facts don't bear that out.
It's tough to look on the face of poverty, and that's part of the reason for the tour. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but you're also doing some very important work with UE Local 150 and also Black Workers for Justice. Talk a little bit about your efforts to gain those collective bargaining rights for public service workers and why there has been, it's been such a long and enduring fight.
Well, I think it's very important. Gene mentions the conditions. I think we got to look at the question of political power. In the communities, particularly down east, where African Americans make up the majority of many of those eastern counties known as the Black Belt. Blackmon makes reference to the Black Belt in his book, the areas where African Americans make up the overwhelming majority of the population. I remember back in the 80s when Black Workers for Justice ran Billy Harvey as the first African American ever to be on the city council down in Fremont, North Carolina. That was the 1980s. I remember also the Hamlet and Pearl food fire, where workers didn't have the basic fundamental right to challenge their safety conditions, particularly fire exits having locks on their doors. As y'all recall, in September 1991, during the Hamlet and Pearl food fire, 25 people burned up in the poultry plant because the owner, Emmett Rowe, put locks on fire exits, ran machines that were broken. And 25 people burned up in that poultry plant. Black Workers for Justice was one of the many organizations that pulled together the coalition that began to challenge the state, the government, to not just spank the Hamlet and Pearl Food Company on the hand there. We wanted Emmett Rowe to go to jail. I'll never forget the posters that we had up, wanted for murder. We had pictures of Emmett Rowe. As you know, he did serve time, in terms of the criminal act that he was responsible for. And also we pushed for, Black Workers for Justice and unions pushed for changes to the health and safety regulations. Not enough inspections. Right. These are the things that the UE 150, the North Carolina Public Service Workers Union, Black Workers for Justice, this is the role they play, helping workers to empower themselves, organize themselves so they can impact public policy. And again, I'll never forget in the 1980s, down in Sampson, Johnson, southeastern North Carolina, where we had a total of 14 convictions for slavery on migrant labor camps. Again, Black Workers for Justice, unions played a role in pushing and changing public policy so that workers would have some vehicle to begin to challenge their general working conditions.
So public policy is very much an instrument in this fight, and you work a lot with public policy concerns at the center. Right. Tell us a little bit more about the Tour on Poverty and what you all are doing, what your goal is, and what you hope to see as a result.
Yeah. Well, first, let me state my agreement, or that is anyone who looks at poverty and looks at economic inequality, which we have really powerful problems with in North Carolina, you can't ignore the question of labor and organization. You know that North Carolina is perhaps the least organized state in the country, and it shows in the polarization of our economic workforce, the difference in wages between and resources between those at the top and those at the bottom. The tour, which starts tomorrow in its first leg and will go across eastern North Carolina, is meant in what we hope is a powerful way to put a face on some of these drier questions of poverty. I work in an academic center, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about statistics and data and the poverty trends, and those are stunning enough, I suppose, when you compare us to other nations that we brag that we're superior to. But they're bloodless. They are those statistics. They don't get across what poverty is like for individuals in North Carolina. Like it was just back from Rocky Mount doing some preparatory work on this, and I'm a father. I look at everything through the lens of being a dad, and talking to a father who can't get necessary health care for his kids. I struggle with that. I think, I don't know how I would react to that. I believe in the nonviolence of Dr. King, but I don't know what my reaction would be if I felt like my kid, who means more to me than anything in the world, couldn't get access to a health care system. So we want to put some flesh and blood and some passion into these questions. The biggest difficulty we have in dealing with poverty, I think, in the United States is that we ignore it. It's invisible to far too many of us.
And I believe, as Reverend Barber said, violently invisible.
It's violently invisible. So what I believe is that we want to educate about this and investigate about it and maybe agitate a little bit, hoping that someday we can legislate and litigate. We have a broad set of challenges that are faced by all those who care about whether we will carry out the sort of Frank Graham's dream of building a fresher and nobler civilization in this ancient Commonwealth.
But what would improvement really look like? Because after all, there will always be various levels of people living in different socioeconomic conditions. And to coin a phrase, I mean, we'll always have the poor. I mean, there's no excuse. And as long as you are not...
a lot of us have heard before.
Yes. And so, given that, and we can't expect a utopia, what does improvement look like?
We're a very long way away from a utopia. We are the wealthiest nation on earth, and yet if you look at all those democracies with which we would compare ourselves, the major advanced Western democracies, we have much greater poverty than they do. We have much, much greater child poverty than they do. I don't know how we explain to ourselves the exclusion of kids from the American dream. And our poverty in the country and in North Carolina is dramatically skewed by race, and it's dramatically skewed actually by geography. chronically poor counties in North Carolina, mostly in the east, a few in the west. So it is true that we'll never reach a utopia, but we don't have to countenance a state and a nation which is such a rank violation of everything that it claims as its aspiration. We're the ones who say we believe in liberty and justice for all, that the nation is dedicated, founded, committed to this notion of equality, and yet we countenance inequality, which countries that don't brag so much about equality would never put up with. And I think we do that in large part because we ignore it. We need to bring the question of poverty, the question of economic inequality, center stage in American life. And then I have a modest hope, I come and go on it, I gotta admit, I have a modest hope that if Americans knew more about poverty, knew more about the great transgressions that we countenance, that we are a generous people and that we would do something about it. Now, a couple of days a week, I'm not so optimistic on that front, but it seems to me that's our first charge, to try to shine as powerful and potent a light on really the plague of poverty in North Carolina as we can.
Because how knowing what exists out there, how could you, if you are a parent out there, how could you stand to see this kind of suffering among the innocent, which is our children? I have just a couple minutes left, but I want to address this question to both of you. What role do you believe government and corporations need to play in ensuring that we decrease poverty in our nation and in North Carolina, and help to create, make sure that there are more fair wages for our labor force? And Gaza?
Well, I know one thing, just as we all know from the Occupy movement, everyday people have to play a role in pushing government, pushing the institutions, pushing corporations in a direction which makes society better for everyone. Without people having power, without people being organized, without workers having the right to organize in their workplace. By the way, that's where most people get their health insurance, through their workplace. Without us having the certain fundamental democratic and human rights to health care, or to have a union so we can fight to win health care, so we can have a secured retirement, so we can work in a safe environment, where we can have the political power to begin to address, the question of whether or not our children have a good education. All these things are important, but they only grow from the power of everyday working people, being able to build the kind of organizations in their workplace through unions, through community organizations like Black Workers for Justice, that actually in some of these rural, primarily African-American counties have been able to make major advances in housing, in better water quality. I never forget the community of Shiloh, which is not far from here in Wake County, struggling to hold a major corporation accountable for poisoning and contaminating their drinking water with PCP. Mm-hmm. And people being empowered is key in their workplace, in their community. Unions obviously play a role. North Carolina has a 3.2% unionization rate, one of the lowest union densities in the U.S.
I want to definitely want to give Gene an opportunity to contribute before we close out.
You asked, Deborah, what role does government have? And one thing we need to just confess up front, government plays quite a large role in the economic inequality that we have now. It plays a large role in favoring the wealthiest among us. Right now in the United States, astonishingly, we tax capital income at a much lower rate than wages. Now, imagine explaining that to a regular human being. That is, if you're a coupon clipper, we're going to take a lot less of your money than if you're a taxi cab driver. So we need to reverse some of these sort of hideous policies, which people with strong economic power have managed to get our government, largely through political donations and the like, to bring to pass. Another example, we have a huge housing program in the United States. People don't tend to think about it very much, but we have a massive housing program. It's the mortgage deduction. It's just that over 80% of the benefits of the mortgage deduction, our federal housing program, go to people making over $100,000 a year. Now imagine how you would explain that. Say, well, we're going to have a huge government intervention in housing, but we're going to direct it mainly to the wealthiest people, and we're going to ignore those at the bottom. We turn equality and opportunity on its head repeatedly with government policies, and we could start by reversing those.
Well, gentlemen, thank you both for your comments. Some really good thoughts for our audience to take away with them. And for more information about today's program and guests, visit us online at unctv.org/BIF. You'll find links to email us your comments and join us as fans of BIF on Facebook. Or you can call us on the BIF line at 919-549-7167. Be sure to meet us right back here each Sunday afternoon at 4:30 for Black Issues Forum. I'm Deborah Holt-Noel. Thank you for spending your time with us.
Quality public television is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC TV.